Welcome to the RegenAG podcast. On our last episode, we got into a lot of different fundamentals of what regenerative agriculture is about. And today we're going to be recapping the 5 main objectives that we are looking at RegenAG Nation. I'm joined today by our 2 agronomists, Trey Reed and Parson Gordon.
Hey, thanks a lot, Roger. Stoked to be back. I don't usually get invites back, so this is a lot of fun for me.
Parson, how are you doing?
Doing great, man. I'm super excited to be back here today, so let's jump into it.
So going back to last week, the 5 things that we were really focused on in this next step here is the principles around what we are doing at RegenAG Nation. Trey, you want to lead into that on what we're focusing on here?
Yeah, so let me jump back just a little bit because I took a little bit of a hard time from more than a few people that had listened and checked into that episode. It was kind of like, hey, these definitions are really what drives things, and they're tried and true, and some of this other stuff isn't quite as proven, and I get all that. Trust me, I get it. That was not the point of it. The point is there are things that are tried and true that we may not be able to pull off in the real world, right? So take cover cropping, for instance. Cover cropping in the field has been one of the more monumental changes from soil health effects that I've seen. We've seen some stuff happen in 2 years of cover cropping that I didn't think could happen in 10 years of doing a really good job of managing your soil and your crops. And so I don't mean to just wipe that off the map and say, hey, those definitions don't fit my objectives, so I'm calling for some different things. It's not that. It's just within somebody's system. Let's say that they farm potatoes, or they farm this, or they don't have access to water, they're dry land. The context is really what we're hitting on. That context is extremely important to if somebody can integrate some of those things. And kind of what we go back to is, what are things that everybody can implement? And to me, that's what this session and this podcast is all about, is some of the things that we've identified that work well in the field and they can be integrated by almost anybody out there.
Well, that's what kind of leads us back into this first objective. And how do we go about enriching and enhancing the soil biology? That's number 1 on our list.
Yeah, no, this is, I think, a great topic, and this is something simple. I'll kind of touch on what Trey was saying there a little bit, and a lot of times it's, working with these larger scale conventional farms and looking to transition, it's these small pieces that actually work. You can't integrate cover cropping on the whole entire farm and figure out how to make that rotation work when you're trying to harvest onions and potatoes and wheat and all the same thing. You just don't simply have the time or manpower to make something like that happen. But enriching and enhancing your soil biology on the farm is something that you can do throughout the season, and there's many practical ways to do that. A lot of time, every conventional farm's applying fertilizer, right? That's something that is a very simple addition, okay? When we're looking at enhancing soil biology in the soil, that doesn't mean you got to come in and change your whole practices on the farm. That means, hey, we're going to start looking at the kind of inputs that we're using on a daily basis, as far as, maybe your NPK inputs or your starter fertilizers on whatever it is, your corn, onions. And we're saying, okay, how do we use a higher quality product? Something that drives biology in the soil. Maybe it's a seed inoculant on the seed piece that has some biology, or something in your corn starter, maybe some mycorrhizae or something like that. And those are the simple implementations that you can do, and they're really not that much more effort than, say, if you were to go down and put this starter mix in your furrow. So you're not changing a whole lot. You're maybe changing, 1 liquid fertilizer for a biological product or something like that. So I would say that's one of the real simple implementations.
Yeah, I think that's just take that. That's exactly right. That he just gave us some examples of how you can do that. If you want to look at it from the standpoint of groups of products or things that we can utilize, probably the 2 with the most history of being able to stimulate microbes in the soil or increase the amount of microbes that are in your soil, because that's what we're talking about doing here. Make no mistake. You either have good biology in your soil, and we're trying to make it even better, increase the activity, increase the number and biomass of that microbial army that you have down there, or what you're doing is you're actually adding specific biology through inoculation. So that's kind of the distinction to me. You're kind of have 2 different categories: biostimulants and inoculants. Now, biostimulants have been around for a long, long time, and we've been utilizing them in agriculture conventionally for a long, long time as well. So it's actually one of those bright spots that we've been doing right. Two things that come to mind is humic acid and kelp. And additionally, we're finding out some new things about these materials as we go along and we look more into them. We used to just think that with kelps, we're talking about putting some hormones into the plant and stimulating the plant that way. With the humic acid, we used to just think about, these big complex carbons, right? So, maybe they were complexing fertilizers or doing whatever. But we're actually finding out that some of these materials are exceptional food sources for microbes. They elicit certain reactions from the microbes as well. And so it's really much more complex than what we've been doing. But the whole point is either to drive more activity and reproduction of those microbes that are in the soil, or to add new groups that we know to be extremely beneficial to crop production, either be it through nutrient cycling or potentially as a suppressive force against pathogens in the soil or any number of other things.
Well, that really leads us into the next topic, which is optimizing plant nutrition and function. So when we talk about optimizing plant nutrition and function, what are we applying, and is timing an important aspect for farmers?
Timing is the most important aspect. Timing's everything in farming. As you guys know, one of the things that is so unique and also complex and challenging about farming is oftentimes we'll have multiple crops per farm, anywhere from 2 to as many as 10, depending on the farm. So understanding the physiology of those crops that you're raising and what your goals are in terms of yield or seed quality, or just even the quality of vegetables or fruits that we're growing, metrics from sugars to total solids. I think understanding, one, what you want as an output and what your goals are there, and then what are those key or optimum times that you can come into the system and influence your goals is extremely important.
Yeah, and we're talking about simple implementations and ways to make these big changes on your farm with simple tactics. And one of the things that I wanted to touch on about the last one, going to the soil biology, and it ties right into plant nutrition and function, is the opportunity to do a small, say, foliar fertilizer with simple micronutrients that enhances the plant's photosynthetic capacity. That is massive potential on your farm for not only feeding and increasing biology and microbes in the soil, but also increasing plant function, because photosynthesis means that your plant is converting a lot more of that energy from the sunlight, utilizing it not only for itself, but also pushing that into the ground as carbohydrates. And those carbohydrates are feeding microbes in the soil and continuing to promote that life below the ground. And those in turn are mineralizing nutrients for you every single moment that they're alive. And so that is a simple thing. Talk about timing. Absolutely critical on those time frames for increasing photosynthesis on those plants. But that's one simple way to optimize your plant function as well.
So people might think that, when they look at this optimizing plant nutrition and function as one thing, why did we group those together as a core principle?
Yeah, it's really important. I think those go hand in hand, absolutely. What we're talking about is, why do we even feed a plant in the first place? Okay, let's say you didn't feed a plant. Well, it's still going to get some of this nutrition from the soil, probably not in the capacity to yield and produce and function the way we want it to in commercial ag. So we don't have the luxury of low yields like we may have in like a garden type setting where we're just feeding our family. We have to get the most that we can out of every acre that we raise. And so really it comes down to, the reason we feed plants is those nutrients and those minerals all have very specific jobs that they carry out within the function of the plant. So some of them are extremely limited, all the way down to molybdenum is for urease conversion and a few things like that that are very crucial to changing nitrogen within the plant to get it into a form that the plant can use, proteins, DNA, those kind of things. So really, we feed plants because it makes them functional. Now, that seems rather obvious. Why would you even bring it up? Well, I think oftentimes we forget about some of the smallest things as well. So we forget to sweep the corners, so to speak. You can feed all of the NPK in the world, and the other part of that is part of optimization is not overfeeding something else, right? Because if you put too much of something into the pipeline, you're actually going to stress the plant out.
You're talking laws of minimums or laws of maximums.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just makes sense that if we eat too much, we get a stomach ache. If a plant eats too much nitrogen, it's going to become bogged down by the very thing that's causing it to be great. It costs the plant a lot of energy in production to convert that nitrogen out. So I think we got to be wise with the way we're feeding. We got to pay attention to a lot of these minor nutrients that maybe aren't being focused on or even considered in conventional textbooks as essential to the plant, but I guarantee you they all add up, and they're all important.
Trey, you mentioned two really important inputs there in enriching and enhancing the biology was kelp and humic acid. Parson, can you list off another 4, 5, 6 different things that our farmers would be interested in that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a few that we're using out there in the field on a daily basis. I can think of molasses, fish hydrolysate, enzyme products. You can think of compost as a way to enrich biology as well. That's a pretty easy thing to source. A lot of people have access to compost around them. We're using things like vermicast teas or compost tea extracts. You can use specific fungal inoculants like mycorrhizae or something like that. There's a tremendous amount of different products or even real natural things. Even things like a lot of people use chicken manure, fertilizers. All of those things have components that will drive biology or have microbes and stuff contained within them. So there's a tremendous amount of really creative things you can look for in products and ways to increase that on your farm.
Yeah, absolutely. The list goes on and on. I mean, you could be talking anything from algae, other food sources for microbes. We talked about lipids and things like that, and fish hydrolysate. You can separate out some of those specific things. Even chitosan is a great biostimulant for the plant and the biology as well. Even putting nutrients like calcium in there really stimulates. And for that matter, activity happens when you put regular nutrition in the form of fertilizers. You start to see through some of the testing that respiration happens as you put fertilizer materials into the soil as well. So as long as you don't get too carried away and they're not too salt laden, then you're also going to get response just from fertilization. But there's a tremendous amount of new products and technology that are coming onto the market. I mean, there's a lot of really strong data on biochar out there right now. The list is pretty exhaustive, which as a grower is great news and also kind of bad news because you got to vet all these materials. But I think that's where you go in and you got to work with people that you trust. So ask for data, ask for, I guess their experiences and make sure that they're there to follow some of this stuff through. If they, pitch you on an idea of, hey, I think this might be great to use, and follow up on that. Make sure that they're doing their job in the field.
We rattle off a lot of these different products and ways to increase that. Something to note about that is not all of them are created equal, and not all of these things produce the same sort of impact. So work closely with knowledgeable, experienced people who have a history of actually making an impact, because that's going to be important to you. A lot of farms, the bottom line, the dollar, the financials is the thing that actually matters. And so what we're trying to do when we go out to people's farm is not just to sell you a product. We're trying to figure out the best advice, the best products, the ones that are going to make the biggest impact for your dollar. So work with people that care about your farm and care about making you wealthy at the end of the day.
So our third topic here is that reducing agrochemicals, and depending on who you talk to in this industry, it could be controversial in saying what is a agrochemical, why do we need it, why we don't need it. I'm going to just allude to something that we mentioned in the last podcast is EIQ, which stands for Environmental Impact Quotient, to where industry is pushing a change in the agrochemicals that we're using. So why is this a preface in in our top 5 things that we're looking at on farms, and how does that relate to enhancing the biology and the plant nutrition on a farm?
I almost think it should be number one, honestly, because it's not that difficult to do in many cases. Oftentimes, we're using things proactively that we don't know for sure we're even going to have a problem. Now, part of that is you need to really be scouting your farm hard, or you need to be working with somebody that's helping you do that, that you can trust. But essentially, the reason for, or the argument for agrochemicals is because they take care of a lot of problems that we have in the field. These problems result in either poor quality or poor yields. I mean, that's just the basis of it. So we got to protect our crops. Oftentimes, we have millions of dollars invested in the crops that are out in the field. And really, the consumer is highly invested in that outcome too, because if we don't produce, then people don't eat. So we're all reliant on each other. But I think the argument for reducing agrochemicals is important in the output and quality of food. I mean, ultimately, don't we want to create the highest nutritious, safest food that we can eat? I mean, we protect our kids, we protect ourselves, we invest in supplements and nutrition and all kinds of things in this world. So, I mean, obviously, using food as a medicine is important. But beyond that, from the standpoint of if I owned a farm, I would be really wary or concerned that one, things could be getting pulled in terms of I see a lot of chemical labels coming off the shelf, or maybe companies pulling them in away from certain crops because they no longer are profitable to them in that crop, or they're risky for them in that crop. I also see a situation where chemicals they create dependency. So if you utilize these things over and over, you just got to continue to stay on that train and ride it out, which gets extremely expensive. You know, the other thing that I really see in talking to some of these people and going to some of the meetings in the off season is they're not approving these chemistries and they're not coming up with new chemistries very often. So that tells me that things are kind of leading down a certain road anyways, where we're going to have limited access to either new tools or even tools that we can use at all. So I think really what we need to do is we need to be proactive in this scenario. When we talk about limiting agrochemical use, we got to be really responsible with the tools that we have right now, which means resistance management. Don't overuse those tools. Don't use them too many times in a season. Mix them with something else that has a different active. Essential oils and botanicals are wonderful for that. I mean, you could put something like a neem oil into an insecticide and have, 14 different chemicals in there, not chemicals, but chemistries that are making an impact on an insect rather than one. And that's resistance management. That's going to protect those tools. It's also going to make them work better. And ultimately, that means that we're going to have these tools around longer to utilize when we need them.
I tell you what, for me, the list goes on and on for all of the reasons to reduce agrochemicals on a farm. One of the interesting things about this sort of opportunity that we have out there with the advancement of more, biopesticides. I always think about this. It's like if I was a farmer, imagine if the insect repellent or whatever I was using was something that I could be perfectly fine putting it on my hands, getting a little bit in my mouth, and knowing that it was never going to affect me. But here we are working with so many chemicals every day for herbicides and insecticides where we got to have gloves on, we got to have glasses on, we got to have a suit on to make sure this stuff doesn't get on us, because it's going to affect our health or the health of the employees that we have working for us or whatever it is. And so for me, it's not just about that, but so many different reasons. I'll tell this one story because it means a tremendous amount to me. This was an experience that I had this previous season where we did a Regen potato trial, and we had the grower's field. We had a 20-acre plot, and right across the street was his full-blown conventional program where they have a lot of different pesticides and stuff going on throughout the year and fumigation. And we ran a full Regen program where we had one fungicide no fumigation. There was a little bit of fungicide on the seed piece, but pretty much really low, fairly normal herbicide program. But to me, when I spent every other week out there scouting that field, it was just unreal to see the amount of life that was out in that field. From a beneficial insect standpoint, there's a few insects out there that we wouldn't want in the field, but some of those things come along with just reducing that agrochemical usage, and none of it was a very big deal. But to me, the beneficial life that was out there was the most intriguing part and rewarding part to see, because you walked across the street, and I'm talking right across the street basically, to that conventional potato field, and you couldn't find a sign of life anywhere. I mean, there wasn't a single thing. There wasn't insects flying 10 feet above those potatoes. There wasn't anything. And that other side of the road, man, it's buzzing with life, and it makes you actually feel like something's happening in that field. And for me, that is super exciting. And so I think there's just the more reasons we find to be very cautious with these heavier chemicals. And I'm not preaching 100% against them, because we've been kind of using them for so long that really it's a detriment to completely cut these out of the system at this point. But we can start figuring ways to implement softer products and start, building more resilient soils and healthier plants. And slowly we start cutting these things out and realizing that we don't need them in the system anymore to be successful.
Parson, you talked about the aspect of human health in this, and all I can think is the economics of a farm, re-entry into the field. And some of our listeners might not understand that. Some of these agrochemicals are sprayed into a field, and there is a re-entry time on when you can go back as a farm worker, as an agronomist, to go check on that crop. So if we can reduce that or eliminate that aspect of from a safety standpoint, and then timing. Trey and Parson you have both touched on timing is absolutely critical, to where if you can't be back in a field for 5 days because of the chemicals used, that is time that boots on the ground where you'd be visually scouting a crop, checking water, checking everything that's going on that farm. And that is huge from an economic standpoint of being profitable.
I love that, Roger. We know you can see this where you're growing an onion crop and you go out there and you've just put some fertility in the ground and your plants are looking pretty good, and you got to come out and do an herbicide, because you got to do an herbicide every so often in those onion crops to keep those weeds out of there. And we all know we spray that down and we see an immediate negative impact on that plant. And it doesn't kill it, but it sets it back a certain amount of time. And so for us, so many of these things align. When we're looking at these 5 ways to integrate regenerative practices on your farm, they all somehow tie together. And so if you're spraying heavy chemicals down and it's hitting that plant leaf, you aren't enhancing plant function or optimizing plant function. And so we're always trying to figure out ways, how can we get away without doing that, still have a beautiful crop at the end of the year that yields really well, but always continually have that in the background where we're thinking, is this application that I'm going to make with this chemical or whatever it is this optimizing my plant's function? And so you got to kind of look at this stair-step approach and think all of these things link together, and how do we make them work?
Sure, and it's checks and balances, because you got to weigh that as a farmer, and this is what they're doing. This is why, chemical usage is prevalent. Let's just take the example that you laid out there, with the onions and the weeds. Well, if you don't spray for weeds, which might cost you as a farmer only $10 an acre to do, you could potentially end up in a situation where you've got a lot of weeds in that field and you have to hand crew that field, which means you got to send a crew through to pull those weeds out so it doesn't drastically reduce your yields or cause you a problem with harvest or whatever, which might cost you $100 an acre now. So I think it's important to point out on the other side of it is a lot of these applications that farmers make at times are the most economical and sustainable for them being able to raise something that doesn't cost so much that the consumer can't afford it. So it's that delicate balance, and I think what it comes down to is just doing it safely and responsibly. Go out, and instead of just saying, okay, yeah, we're going to spray this on every acre, you go out and you scout the fields. look for the problems and see if it's something that you need to do, if you can get away with. This whole conversation, the solution to it is scouting to see if you have the issue. And then, in my mind, one of the things you can institute is biocontrols. So biocontrols can mean many things. One, a biocontrol can be something that Parson alluded to earlier with his example of some of those beneficials in the field. By the way, those are free. If we don't eliminate them by putting something out there that keeps them from wanting to be in our field, they're going to come in. There's a higher order, right? It's that food chain. So they're going to come in and they're going to help us protect for free. Oftentimes we see ladybugs in the field. No brainer. Oftentimes when we see that, there's an aphid or something hanging around. And they're pretty good at gobbling those things up and taking care of those problems for them if we're not spraying something to get rid of them in the first place. So a ladybug or something we see in hops, they'll use Persimilis or Californicus, where they'll actually release these beneficials into a field. Now, that gets pretty expensive. We can't do that in corn to control mites, right? So that's where the economics come in. Other biocontrols, soft chemistry products, we mentioned oils, botanicals. Some of those are extremely effective, especially in combination. They're even more effective in combination. Now, some other options. We're starting to get into the boutique designer type products where some of these microbes are actually meant, these specific strains will actually take care of other problems or pathogens. So we see that either as a fungicide, a biological fungicide, or a soil biological bactericide or fungicide. So we're getting to where we're designing and finding out what the higher order is of microbes. And in the future, I truly believe that a lot of the better answers will come from the biology side anyways. And it's really going to be companies figuring out what microbes take care and control other ones. And that's what we're going to be applying. And those will be a lot more easily approved, and those will be a lot safer for, our farm workers, our bees, just everybody. And so I think that's where you start getting into that, and everybody wins by reducing those heavy chemical inputs and getting other things into the system. All right, so before we get off this topic, I want to ask Parson, because we have a philosophy that we've kind of created and cultivated in the last few years. And he spends an awful lot of time out in the field looking for these issues. And so what is kind of our rule of thumb when it comes to reducing agrochemicals?
The main thing is leading out with soft chemistry products. This is absolutely critical for us, because if we come out and put a heavy chemical, we're going to have a lot of negative impact. And our goal with those soft chemistry products is to protect the plant's performance for as long as possible, protect the beneficials on the plant or in the soil. A lot of times with those hard chemical products, they target a certain thing, and they do a wonderful job of taking care of that. But there's a whole 90% of that product is hitting these non-target things that are making a negative impact. And so that's the most important rule at hand for us at reducing agrochemicals.
Bingo. Nailed it just like that. And that's so true. Now, of course, you have to research what that soft chemistry is. Like if that's a product that you're utilizing, obviously you have to, look into that and say, hey, is it qualified, or is the data there that suggests it'll do just as good of a job at cleaning up something, and is it safe truly for beneficials? The other thing too is a lot of times you'll go out there and you'll count beneficial populations in the field. Does this warrant an application, say on the insecticide for aphids or something like that? Or do I have a good enough beneficial population out there? So I think you still got to be in the field. You still got to be understanding what the limitations are of the products. But absolutely. I mean, if you got something out there that's working for you for free, then why would you go out there and kill it? I mean, let's breathe life into this system. And usually when you do that, it pays you back.
Great. That is awesome. I love that you're giving practical information on this. Jumping into our last two topics, they're kind of tied together. We are going to address them separately. Really reducing synthetic fertilizers and increasing efficiency, and also increasing soil carbon. So, Parson, why don't you jump in and tell our listeners how and why we're doing that?
I think it's a big deal, and like we've been kind of talking about, these 5 objectives really tie really well together. And so much of what we're doing when we're focusing on the plant's nutrition and the health of the plant and the soil is you end up putting yourself in a position where if those microbes in the soil are working for you and they're, mineralizing nutrients and you are fixing nitrogen and these things, all these different processes are happening, you end up naturally reducing your inputs on the farm because now the natural functions of the soil and the plant are working closer to their maximum capacity, and you're no longer having to apply and add a whole bunch of these extra things into the system. It's just not asking for it anymore. So, and then also when we're talking with different products, we've talked about product quality, we've talked about not all products being created equally. This is a big deal. So we talk about fertilizer efficiency, and this comes down to not only the quality of your inputs, but how you utilize them. A lot of times on these conventional farms, we're not asking for these guys to go ahead and reduce their inputs heavily or cut out a whole bunch of nitrogen. We're going and saying, how can we make these products that you're utilizing more efficient and buffer out some salts in that higher salt fertilizer that you're using, put some molybdenum in with your nitrogen, helps it convert inside that plant, helps it actually be utilized. You're putting a little bit of carbon products with it. It holds it in the soil profile longer. It also makes it just generally more available to that plant. So those are a few of the things that I think of when we come to this topic of fertilizer efficiency and reducing inputs.
Synthetic inputs overall are great for yield, but I think this is a conversation about downstream effects in my mind. So what are some of those downstream effects? Well, if you fertilize heavily, let's say you're using dry fertilizers very heavily in your program, which isn't probably the most efficient way, but in some operations, maybe it's the only way to get all that fertility down, you've got a lot of chemical salts. And those chemical salts have a lot of downstream or detrimental effects, especially over time on those soils, on the biology, all those sort of things. So if we didn't have the downstream effects, everything would be fine. Commercial fertilizers, no big deal. Same thing with some of the other synthetic inputs. Call it a fungicide, call it an insecticide, call it a herbicide. If you spray, you take care of the pest or the weed or the problem, but the downstream effect of that is you could set the plant back. You can decrease its ability to defend itself, right? And when we look at things like the disease triangle, we understand that the plant has to have low health, we have to have the right environmental conditions, and we have to have a pathogen present. So it's not advantageous to apply something to a crop that is going to decrease the health of it, first and foremost, because then you open yourself up to potential pathogens, insects, all those kind of things. So I think really for me, it's a conversation about what are the negatives that go along with the positive of what you're doing. And that's where you go into some of this stuff in regenerative agriculture. It's a conversation about just using some of these other inputs that might have less downstream effects. For example, compost. Compost is one of the most readily available, sustainable, and greatest ways to fertilize your crop and improve your soil health, carbon, biology, all at the same time. An absolute powerhouse input. You talked about being able to get phosphorus into the plant. We've seen things in testing where we're getting far more phos, we're getting far more potassium, and in some cases, we're actually getting a lot of nitrogen benefit that we wouldn't expect. And I think a lot of that comes down to it's not available right away and then gone. It's this slow release or timed release based on the biology, the temperatures, and all those sort of things. So this, to me, is just a conversation about how can we use a sustainable input in place of that? Not how we have to replace every synthetic input, but how can we roll some of these other products that are maybe a waste product, right? That's incredibly sustainable at the same time, rather than going and digging up a bunch of fertilizer and turning it into a water-soluble source or, converting it in these chemical or in these fertilizer plants. So anyways, I hope that is something that kind of frames that conversation as well.
Definitely. I think that's excellent points on, how we're affecting the efficiency in the soil of utilizing the nutrients that are at hand. And I guess that just kind of leads us into the next topic of our final is increasing that soil carbon. I mean, for people that are totally novice in this world, why is carbon such an important thing for what we are doing? And then why do we want to increase that in the soils here in the Treasure Valley and nationwide?
Well, it's a complex topic, soil carbon. There's a lot of different sources of soil carbon. Probably the most recognizable by people are something that you would see on a soil report, and that's the organic matter in the soil. The two biggest reasons why the organic matter or carbon levels of the soil are important is because they have the ability to hold on and become a store for nutrients to be released to the crop. And they also have the ability to hold way more water in our soils, which if you're working without irrigation water, that's everything to you. The ability to hold on to nutrients and water and have them be released for a longer time frame for your crop is absolutely essential. That could be a 50 bushel difference in your corn if you can hold on to more water in the soil. So it's insanely important. I mean, I think it's a big deal. And probably the reason why our organic matters are lower comes down to tillage. We have spent a long time tilling our soils. Now, when you do that, you open up the soil to oxidation, and that carbon is easily consumed by mainly bacteria in your soil. And then you're going to burn that off. You're going to oxidize and burn that carbon off. So out here in these soils, like native soils would maybe be 2.5% organic matter if they were native. Not super high compared to, a muck soil, say in New York. But the point is if we've got 0.8% organic matter, we've lost a ton of not only nutrient storehouse, water storehouse, but also the way that carbon makes the soil function and kind of buffers it.
I think carbon is king, guys. We got to figure out how to put carbon in the soil at every opportunity that we have ultimately. There's so many ways that we look at doing that on a daily basis in these farms but it can be whether it's through your carbon complexing your micronutrients for foliars, or we're putting that in the soil. Often we'll put it in with, some humic in the soil, or putting a carbon product with our nitrogen. There's a tremendous amount of ways that you can integrate this. You do that often through just putting compost in the soil is a big thing. Cover cropping. I don't want to dive too deep into this because we're going to have some people later on talking about cover cropping, but that's one big way to increase soil carbon. When you get a green cover crop, you turn that into the soil. That's increasing organic matter. You got roots in the ground. All of these different things are helping you store more carbon in the soil. Even if you're in, say, an onion crop or something where you have drip irrigation, we often are putting a humic down there, and it's putting it right by that root system. It's kind of like a little microclimate for these root crops. There's a lot of ways to integrate this. I would say, guys, think about that often. Figure out simple ways to do that on your farm, and try and figure out as many ways as possible because it is going to pay you big time financially.
That's going to round out our 5 topics for this podcast. And really the next subject we're getting into on RANPOD 3 is really the crux of regenerative agriculture. And it's our philosophy that is going to kind of shake the foundation on this next topic of soil health versus productivity. And when I say that, we talk about the ground along a fence line or the ground in a forest, and forest doesn't have to produce everything in a year versus a farm. We have to feed people. We got economics behind it of people making a living. So you're not going to want to miss it. Check back in with us next Friday when RANPOD 3 drops.